Hey guys, so there were a number of things that I wanted to talk about today. The first of which is an unfortunate phenomenon, I guess, that a lot of the next generation, the young people, and unfortunately it's not just the young people, and it's also not all of the young people. I'm not saying it's like all Gen Z people. There's some really smart Gen Z people that I'm somewhat in touch with, and unfortunately there's some, I would argue, less intelligent millennials and some from the older generations as well. But more so today, more people are getting a lot of their news and their worldviews not by legitimate sources or by looking at how things are, but unfortunately by influencers on the internet. Whether it's, I'm sorry, but Russell Brand or whoever else, right? And so I think that is an indictment of this free market capitalist aspect of political commentary where you don't become more successful than other people by being more accurate or more nuanced or well thought out. And in fact, it's often the case that it's the opposite. The more inflammatory you are, the more views you get, and the more money you make. Maybe sometimes the more hyperbolic you are. And ironically, I think from what I've heard, this person, Hasan Piker, is like not a fan of pure capitalism, but ironically, he used the worst parts of it to become rich and somewhat internet famous. And I think he's kind of self-aware about this, but I guess that is what it is. It would be nice if we did have a system where the most truthful and the most accurate public intellectuals or academics had more attention and reach and recognition. Like, the better you are actually, the more money you make and the more reach you have, as opposed to the opposite. All right, having said that, this person brought up Taiwan, so obviously I'm going to talk about it. And it's often the case that this specific certain sort of set of online influencers, it's often the case that the truth is the opposite of what they're perceiving, and turned out to be the case here too. So let's take a look at what he said. I already know it's going to give me a number of headaches, but we'll try to react to it in real time.
It's like if Texas used to, like, the Confederate States used to rule America, okay, and they were pretty fucking brutal.
Okay, right there. Oh, it's so funny how, like, even just 10 seconds and I have to, correct him. The Confederate States didn't rule America, all right? They were, you could say they were a faction in America, but they didn't rule America. And from what I've heard from him, his sort of shtick is, he's going to try to paint the PRC as the good guys and try to compare them with the Union, which really it's the opposite. And they're going to try to paint the ROC as the Confederates, to paint them as the bad guys. But that's the problem with these kinds of influencers, is that they change things in order to fit their worldview, as opposed to, I guess, just looking at the facts. The country of the United States of America was the Union. The country in China at the time was the ROC, the Republic of China. The Confederacy seceded, the communists in China seceded from the Republic of China. The Confederates declared their independence. The communists in China also declared their independence. The Confederacy drew up their new flag. The communists in China drew up their new flag. The communists in China, came up with a new constitution saying we don't identify with the establishment, the government of China. I don't know if the Confederacy wrote up their own constitution, but you get the idea, right? The Union was the country, the ROC was the country, and the communists of China and the Confederacy seceded, declared independence, they came up with a new flag, and they came up with their own constitution. And this person here wants to paint the ROC as the more brutal ones so that they can paint Taiwan as the bad guys and paint the PRC as the good guys. The problem with that, and you could say both the PRC and ROC at the time were both authoritarian, just like both North Korea and South Korea were both authoritarian. back in the day. I mean, it was sort of McCarthyism, but Asian, which is more brutal, right? But he wants to paint it as the ROC and probably the ROK were the bad guys. And that's why he wants to compare them with the Confederacy. The problem with that is just look at the death toll of the PRC. If he actually cared about the Chinese people, why is he trying to whitewash the regime that led to more deaths of Chinese people than all of the foreign colonial imperialists during the century of humiliation combined? Let me repeat that. If he actually cared about the Chinese people, why is he whitewashing the regime that led to more deaths of Chinese people than all of the foreign colonial imperialists during the century of humiliation combined? Tens of millions of dead Chinese people, if he actually cared about the Chinese people. That is why there are millions of Chinese people around the world that oppose the PRC, quote unquote communist China or red China. It would be like if the Confederacy in America during the American Civil War, if the Confederacy won the American Civil War and then started to disrespect the Union culture, they tore up the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, maybe there was some early, American art that they started to tore. They burned the books of, the Union's finest intellectuals and all of that, anyone that opposed them. And the Union, let's say they retreated to an island that they had barely ruled before, okay? But then that the Confederacy then went on to rule all of America, and they imposed slavery. And if he actually cared about the accuracy of his analogy, Confederacy was in favor of slavery. The PRC did forced labor. How do you think that Americans would feel? Americans who believed in the best ideals of the Union, but admitted that they had not yet lived up to their best ideas, but wanted to. They wanted to, they were willing to, fight a war to end slavery because they wanted the entirety of America to end slavery. But imagine if that never happened. But there were Americans who believed in America where all of America ended slavery, but that never happened. These Americans who lived in the last place that the Union ruled, they kept thinking that we're just gonna, settle here for a bit and then we're gonna go back and we're gonna defeat the Confederacy and we're gonna end slavery. But imagine if that never happened. That's sort of the mentality of some Chinese people overseas that never happened, that the wrong side won the Chinese Civil War and the best ideas of what China could have been were never fulfilled. And I don't want to ascribe malice towards this person. I don't know if he knows these things but is just being dishonest. I don't think so. I think he just has his sort of ideology and he wants to impose it on things to fit that ideology. So I'm not gonna prescribe, malice towards him.
And then there was like a union revolution, and then also
so he's flipping things again, right? The ones that I don't think that he's being dishonest. I think like I said, I think he has his ideology and he's trying to, I think they call it revisionist, that he's trying to change things in order to fit that ideology. It was the ROC that was the country in China, like the Union was the country in America, and it was the communists that had their uprising. They wanted to secede and declare independence from the ROC, and the Confederates also seceded and declared independence from the Union. He's getting it exactly the other way around.
So a massive war on top of that, and massive massive war crimes that were occurring. And then
occurring by who?
The Confederate States of America just basically seceded and were able to have their own thing separately, and they still laid ownership. They still originally laid claim to the entirety of America.
Yeah, so I've said it a number of times now. The Confederacy did secede from the Union, like the communists seceded from the ROC. But then they took over the rest of the country. So it's like if the Confederacy won the American Civil War and took over the rest of the country, and the Unions retreated to, let's say, an island because they believed that their ideal of America was better, so they wanted to, their dream was to one day go back and defeat the Confederacy. And remember, I mean, like, if you had to choose, where would you rather have lived? In the Union or the Confederate States? And so if you are an American back then who believed in ending slavery for all of America, that was sort of the mindset, that they would have wanted to go back and defeat the Confederacy so that they could end slavery in all of America.
And the Union kept growing and growing as a superpower around
The other thing that's wrong with what he's saying is he's trying to compare the Confederacy seceding, which they did, but that's obviously more like the communists seceding from the ROC. But yeah, like it wasn't the ROC that seceded from the communists. It was the communists that seceded from the ROC. So it's like I hope he's able to learn that he got the analogy perfectly backwards. Like the only comparison, like the only way for his analogy to work is just saying whoever won the military conflict, that's how he's drawing the comparison. But if you think whoever wins in a military conflict is the righteous one, that's called might makes right. And I'm sure Hasan here can think of multiple instances in wars and conflicts where, you know, one side had more power militarily and they won and they took over land, but he would probably oppose the one that won, the one that was more powerful and took over land. You know, just because you know, whether it's the European colonists in Canada or the US, or other than trying to, you know, paint the PRC as the good guys and whoever is aligned with the US as the bad guys, other than that motive to retroactively make his analogy work, another thing that people like him or other people could do is, oh, well, the Confederacy lost the American Civil War, therefore because the ROC or the Chinese nationalists lost the Chinese Civil War, that's why they are analogous. The problem with that is if you think that whoever wins a military conflict is the righteous one, and that's the only way that you're drawing comparisons is whoever won a fight, a violent fight, that's called might makes right. And I'm pretty sure this person can think of a bunch of wars and conflicts where a stronger power took land from a weaker people, and I'm pretty sure this person wouldn't say, well, whoever lost that military fight, that violent fight, is analogous with the Confederacy because the Confederacy lost the American Civil War. I'm pretty sure he could think of a number of examples where a stronger side defeated a weaker side, but he would oppose the stronger side. And he wouldn't say that the weaker side that lost, whether it's people or land, is analogous to the Confederacy just because they lost a military fight. And I would hope that he thinks about that. You know, I'm sure everyone watching this right now could think of a number of examples where a number of conflicts or wars where one side won because they were, you know, more powerful, or they won for a number of reasons, but not because they were the righteous one. And I think it's important for people to know, why were the communists able to win that Chinese Civil War? It was because they took advantage of the Japanese invasion of China. They let their rival, the legitimate government of China, take the brunt of the invasion. I think there were reports of them like stealing equipment and ammunition from behind them after every conflict was over, when the nationalists were going to the next battle, and the communists would just go from behind them and just steal what was left over. And start conscripting peasants, so that by the end of the Japanese war, when the Japanese, you know, retreated, the Chinese nationalists, they lost most of their men, and then the communists had like these millions of people that are ready to go. And there are also reports of when Mao met with Japan after they were able to take over China. Mao actually thanked the Japanese for doing what they did, you know, killing and raping millions of Chinese people, saying, you know, I have to thank you, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to take over China. And then proceeding to kill China's best and brightest, setting China back 20 years. You know, and when you lead to the deaths of tens of millions of your own people, you're setting your country back generations. Where would China be today otherwise? You're killing your country's best and brightest intellectuals, academics. You're destroying Chinese artifacts, burning Chinese books, ancient books and scrolls that we'll never know the contents of. These things are priceless. And I understand that, the whole thing with like simplified Chinese, I understand that there were already a lot of like simplified words before that were used for a long time, but they were the ones that wanted to scrub the standardized Chinese, and from our perspective, it's perversing it. It took a foreign cock Asian dictator, Stalin, to stop the supposed Chinese leader from completely destroying his own Chinese culture. Because Mao wanted to get rid of Chinese characters altogether. He wanted to create a phonetic system where you create Chinese alphabet instead of using, Chinese characters, which is a pretty important part of Chinese culture. Ironically, there is a Mandarin Chinese alphabet that was invented by a Chinese person, a mainland Chinese person, invented in mainland China, but it got brought over with the Chinese nationalists to Taiwan, and it's like a perfect alphabet for Mandarin, but they don't want to use it because it's in Taiwan. So it's like, you can imagine why there are millions of Chinese people around the world because of these reasons. They do not support the PRC. And it's also why a lot of the Chinatowns around the world, they still have the original, Republic of China flag in their Chinatown. But it's people like this that are foreigners, that are not Han, not Chinese, not Taiwanese, that want to impose their own myopic worldview onto other people's conflicts that they don't know anything about. And I would just ask that people like him to have the humility to understand that this is another people's conflicts, and you might not, you might think that you know everything, but that just because the reality, the facts don't fit your worldview doesn't mean that you should get to try to force it to, and try to like influence a whole generation of people instead of just looking at the facts.
Planet, and then inevitably all of the other countries that were primed against the United States of America decided, actually, okay, never mind, we are no longer acknowledging that like the Confederate States is the real America. We're now acknowledging, and Texas being like the remainder Confederate state that like lost the war, basically was able to secede.
Yeah, so again, his only comparison is whoever won the military fight. And again, that's called might makes right. And again, I'm sure this person can think of multiple examples where, just because somebody lost a military conflict, just because somebody was able to win a military conflict and take over land, that doesn't make them right. Just because a 200-pound person on the street beats up a 100-pound teenager or woman or child, or does take your pick, that doesn't mean that the 200-pound bully is right.
Regardless, but was still laying claim to the entirety of America and maybe even fucking Canada, okay? And then all of America's enemies around the world.
Yeah, so this is another aspect of the ROC PRC conflict that most people don't know. So people like to say, oh, well, Taiwan actually still claims all of China and more. Number one, they don't know about the constitutional amendments that we've made. So that's something that they need to look up. Number two, they need to realize that this claim over China was because they originated in China. They were the legitimate establishment government of China. We've made constitutional amendments since then, but also that constitution was carried over from mainland China to Taiwan. When this constitution was written, Taiwan wasn't a part of any China. It was colonized by Japan. People also need to realize that the intentions of governments and their people are not always the same thing as what's on paper. What's on paper in black and white isn't always caught up with the people of that country or even the government. And to which people like him will probably go, well, why don't you guys just change it? We've made constitutional amendments, number one, but number two, people like him won't realize that the main obstacle to changing it completely is not us, and it's not because we don't want to. It's the PRC. The PRC wants us to keep that claim that we are China so that they could trap us. So it's like we're saying, look, we don't want to be the one and only China. You be China would just be Taiwan. So essentially saying like writing that in our, making that complete change in our constitution. The PRC has said if we did that, they would invade us. So it's not because we want to maintain these claims and that we're still wanting to fight the PRC for these claims and that we want to like invade mainland China and retake the mainland. It's the PRC that wants us to keep that in our claim. They want us to keep that in our constitution. They have threatened us, saying that if we change that in our constitution, that they would invade. People like him don't know this. I'm going to leave it here for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you're all doing well. All right, peace.